Hey, I'm Alan Firstenberg,
Hello, and I'm Michal Stanislawek.
and welcome back to Two Voice Devs.
What is that?
Michal, wonderful as always to have you here. I am so glad you're able to do this today.
I'm so happy and thank you for the invite.
So specifically, you made a post, I guess it was like over a month ago now at this point. It's been a chaotic spring so far, um, where you were talking about MCP
Mhm.
and how it was really, really beginning to take off in the AI field in general. And I've been looking for somebody to help me understand MCP, and you were courteous enough to volunteer. So thanks for joining me again to discuss it.
No, absolutely, my pleasure.
So I guess let's start with what does MCP stand for, and what is it? Let's kind of start with the basics.
Well, it stands for Model Context Protocol, and
Okay.
effectively, I always describe it as a wrapper or a layer of abstraction above an API that makes it available to a client running an assistant with an LLM in the background. That's basically my definition. I'm not sure whether it is a full definition, as in, and as per the Anthropic's definition, but that's basically how I understand it, and I don't think that falls too far from the way it's being used at the moment.
Okay. And you mentioned Anthropic. This was a protocol that Anthropic originally proposed,
Yep,
correct?
yep. They proposed
And
it quite a long time ago, actually. They proposed it probably over half a year ago, but initially it didn't take off. And at some point, in the last 2 months, I guess, there's this boom about the MCP servers and MCP clients as well. So I think there was this period of people trying to, find a place for it, I guess.
I started a conversation with Mark
Hmm.
the other day as we were planning upcoming shows, and I mentioned this one to him, and he said, "Oh, I've got two questions about MCP because I'm still trying to wrap my head around it too."
My first question is what pain points are MCP servers supposed to solve?
That's a very good question. And I'm not entirely sure I'm going to be able to give you like a very objective answer. I think, from my perspective, the pain point that MCP is trying to alleviate is to allow normal people to hook up to effectively APIs and to hook up
Mm,
to functionality that is offered by other software, really. Um, and I think that there's a huge misunderstanding. I'm not entirely sure whether I understand it properly or whether I understand the intentions behind it properly, because that's still, I'm sure we're gonna get into that during our discussion today, but that's still something that I don't want to say is contradicting, but it's certainly not fully clear from the documentation, at least not to me.
mm, okay. I know that when I've been thinking about it, and as I've been kind of beginning to understand it a bit more, I kind of think of it as, if you're using Google's Gemini chat app,
Mhm,
they have the ability to say, go to my Google Drive and get this
mhm,
information, and go to, Google Maps and get this information. So they have a way that you can play within Google's ecosystem and get information from other Google services.
mhm.
I feel like this was Anthropic saying, oh, gee, we don't have any services
Mhm.
of our own, but let's create a standard way so that anybody can provide a service
Yeah,
and we'll give you access to it.
and that's sort of what it felt to me initially as well. Although the reality of it looks somewhat different because it feels like the user has to become the middleman between the service provider and themselves. So, in other words, the reality of the protocol at the moment is that you have to install those MCP servers on your own local machine in order to become the MCP server, in order to be able to use it as a client. Which, if you think, from a perspective of like client server architecture that we've certainly have been, used to in all these years, dating back, doesn't quite make sense. And that's why, I think using client server might not have been the best choice of wording for this.
Interesting. Okay. I feel like that both was not something I realized also explains some of the issues that I was beginning to have with it. So maybe the best, before we get into that, can you kind of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of what the best direction to take
I think
in this is.
I think what's like, if anyone wants to understand what it is, right? The best thing is the quick start for Claude Desktop on the MCP page, modelcontextprotocol.io. If you go to quick starts, if you go to how to set up Claude for desktop users, they basically tell you how you can do that. And to do this, you actually have to go to your Claude Desktop, open up developer settings, and edit config. And this is how a typical user has to set up an MCP server. And then what you have to do is you have to effectively write a bunch of JSON as a user with things that you don't understand, like commands. You have to make sure that you're running Node.js within your server, or potentially Python, depending on the MCP server, right? And then you have to provide arguments for the command that is running the npx or whatever else is the command to run the MCP server. And then you've lost, most of the users, right?
Right. I'm already lost on this, it feels like. I mean, so one of the things that I thought MCP was going to be offered. Now, I guess what MCP offers is that communication protocol, is what it sounds like.
It offers more. It offers definitely, like as a protocol, it offers more because you've got the concept of the transports, which is that communication bit, but you also have a notion of resources, prompts that the server can define for you, tools, obviously, which is the main component, I guess, that is being used at the moment, and that sort of exposes the underlying APIs as tools to the clients. But that's mostly it. I mean, there are some other concepts, but I'm not too familiar with them to be discussing them in depth.
I feel like it's the tools that have gotten all the attention. The fact that you had this concept of remote tools, their API and their description and their the schema for them, as we would say as developers, gets defined and gets made available in an easy, compact form. So you could just say, load all of these predefined tools for me already. I mean, I kind of think of it like as a library of tools that are already assembled for you.
Yes, for a given MCP server, which means effectively for a given piece of software.
Okay.
Like Slack, for example.
And I guess what kind of I was wondering, so it sounds like it's got a little bit of a discovery component as well. You can point it at a server, you can point your client at a server and just say, use the tools, use the resources that are available at this server.
Yeah.
Right?
So effectively from that perspective, absolutely. In terms of discovery of the MCP servers, not so much. This is something that is, I mean, if you look at their roadmap, this is something that is definitely there on the roadmap. We have a registry that they want to develop up. But I'm not entirely sure how that's gonna work. Other than potentially maybe acting as something that right now is a void that is being filled in by all these different installers or installer tools, because there is all that hype around MCPs. So obviously a lot of users are like, oh, I want to use this, right? This MCP, this the new hot thing, right? So I need to be using MCP servers. So, and they're like Python, what is that, right? Or Node what? So the only reasonable thing for them is to use some sort of an installer. that installs stuff out of the box for you, that potentially has this directory of MCP servers that you can just, select, tap, 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 and then install it, and then suddenly you've got it available in your cloud desktop. The problem with that is that that the trust elements, like how much can you trust a random installer from the internet to install software that runs locally on your computer within the context of your entire system.
And this is the part that keeps getting to me, is the fact that it ends up being something that is local.
Yep.
Which
initially, my initial reaction to MCP was like, perfect, right? We're going to see all these MCP servers that are going to be able to connect to S-tools, right? So imagine Slack. Slack is a good example. Slack is going to give me an MCP server that is going to authenticate me with my user account and is going to give me access to all the Slack servers I've got access to, right? The reality, though, is different. I have to install a piece of software on my computer locally that then connects to the Slack APIs and does stuff for me, which is just counterintuitive. Like for me as a developer, right? Completely.
For me as a developer, it is as well. I mean, when I first started seeing people saying, I have this brand new Google Drive compatible MCP, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Somebody went and, took all of the Google Drive and the Google Docs and the Google Sheets APIs, and there's 100 of them. There's a ton of those APIs.
Yep.
Somebody did all of that and bundled it into an MCP server because Google hasn't done that yet. That's awesome. And then when I go and take a look, it's things like, you can search for documents on your Google Drive, install this program, go through these steps to generate your key. And I'm like, whoa, what? And I guess that kind of leads me to one of my big questions is, there's no authentication here.
Not as part of the protocol itself. I mean, during the transport, they're saying like you have to deal with this, that, and the other. Like if you look through the documentation in the transports, they're gonna tell you like, yeah, you have to deal with authentication, authorization. You have to deal with data security, use TLS, and all the like typical stuff that you would see. But it's not defined anywhere, right? Which to some extent, you might think it's fine, right? It's going to be the developers that are going to take care of that. But then we come back to the issue of trust, right? You have to install a piece of software from someone. You have to generate those tokens, and going forward, it probably is going to be automated, right? Right now, is too much of a cumbersome process for a lot of people, but still, you have to generate tokens that, if stolen, right, or if somebody who's the provider of that MCP somehow gets access to them, if they get access to all your Gmail, for example, or your mails and stuff like that, which is a nightmare from a security perspective. A nightmare.
It's kind of terrifying. I guess I feel like from a pure client server point of view, we nowadays, we are wise enough to think about authentication isn't something that's slapped on. It's something that's integrated into the protocol. This doesn't feel like a client-server protocol in that sense. So I understand why it feels like this thing that's meant to run locally.
And this is an interesting thing, because there's this general architecture diagram, which I skimmed through. Like introductions is some things that I rarely read, right? I get to the meat. But when I was preparing for this call, I actually went back to the documentation just to review it, and I look at the introduction, and you've got this nice picture of your computer that hosts MCP servers, then either use local resources or go to the internet to retrieve remote resources. But in the general architecture, in the introduction, there is no remote MCP server as such. So that gave me a little bit more insight into what they might have been thinking, is that the MCP server was designed to be a local component.
Interesting.
And from that perspective, it starts making a little bit more sense. but then it still doesn't from the taxonomy perspective. It's not really a client server type of an architecture. I mean, to some extent it is, right? But not in the traditional sense, where the server is the remote thing that provides functionality for you, and you're the client somewhere else.
Right. No, that's really interesting. That I mean, and in some ways, I can appreciate why the notion of the MCP server
Mhm.
being a local server, in some ways that makes sense, because from a different angle on trust, it means that it's local.
Mhm.
You're running it, you can trust it, you've got your keys are there.
Mhm.
You don't need to give them to somebody
Mhm.
else. They're local. If you think of it in the context of, running something on your phone,
Mhm.
okay, this is another, this is a server running on your phone, but everything is on the phone. Everything you trust is local. And I can sort of get that, but it does raise that issue of how do you trust what you're putting on your machine?
Well, that's that, right? The counterpoint for that approach, where everything is local, you keep everything yourself, is you authenticate with your service provider, because we already have service providers like Google. We already have service providers like Slack, and others. Why wouldn't they provide MCP servers that effectively would be a slightly different way of providing APIs, really?
Right. Well, and I guess that's kind of one of the things that when I first heard about this MCP protocol, I'm like, well, that's nothing new.
Mhm.
We've had protocols for years. REST with JSON is kind of an informal version of that.
Mhm.
SOAP was a very formal version
Yeah.
of that. Very, very, very formal. Is MCP on at least some level just that?
Well, I mean, MCP is JSON RCP that is being serialized into an MCP protocol, like into the transport, right? And then a JSON RCP RPC on the other end, right? So it is effectively a JSON RPC, if you think about it.
And for developers who aren't as old as we are, RPC is remote procedure call.
Yes.
This is, again, it's not a new concept.
Nope.
RPC, I mean, RPCs were, we're going back to Sun OS, I think, were
Oh,
the
yeah.
first ones that I remember talking about it. And that's decades ago at this point.
Yep. Kind of like some really, really old protocols. That was, it felt at some point, it felt like RPCs is a song of the past, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
And I like how we keep getting tripped up on these RPC, RCP,
Yes, yeah.
MPC, MCP. Yeah.
Chat GTP.
Yes. I feel like, though, what's good about this is that it has formal. I mean, for all of my reservations and issues about it, to be fair, and I apparently have more than I thought I did. The advantage is that it is creating this nice. It's the beginning of this standardized framework.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the good thing about it is that people are adopting it. However bad or, incomplete it might be, right? That's at least something that a lot of people start to agree upon, which is a great thing in itself. But I think if we think about it, and this was the point of at least the first post that I made about MCPs, is that it makes sense if you think about MCP server as a plugin, effectively, right? Because it makes sense for specialized software that you as a user might have no clue about. Think about Blender as a perfect example, right? I have no idea how to design stuff or components, 3D stuff in Blender, but I can use my voice. I can express what I want. And that's where it makes sense. I would love to have an MCP plugin for my local Blender, a local plugin, which again makes more sense, right? That is provided by either Blender as the manufacturer of the software, or a trusted plugin developer, which runs in the context of that piece of software. And then I use my clone desktop and I say, hey, now design me a 3D shaped heart or whatever. And then I get it in my Blender and it's perfect. That's how we can add this, the notion of AI and the notion of giving users the ability to describe what they want and get it in that specialized software. And to me, that makes perfect sense.
And if you think about this in the context of an operating system, for example, we now have this concept finally of being able to say, I'm going to install this app. And a graphical operating system, that means that that app has exposed itself through an icon that appears in a certain place. Maybe it will respond to messages that will automatically launch it. So if you've got your address book, for example, if you click on a person and say send email to this person, it launches the right program. That level of interfacing, MCP is the first thing that's starting to address that question of what is an AI app? And they're saying an AI is an MCP app.
You're
making a face there.
No, I doesn't still fully agree to that. I mean, again, to me, like a plugin, yes, right? A plugin for something, because an app to me is a standalone piece of software, right? A Blender is an app. Blender with an MCP server is to me is a Blender, still Blender is an app with an MCP or this AI plugin, like this AI enabler. But again, it doesn't necessarily, the server bit doesn't fit for me here. Plugin,
right?
Yes.
I guess I'm moving away from the notion from thinking of it as a server and thinking of it as the app itself. So in a future, Claude OS.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
In a Claude OS or a Gemini OS, you're going to need to you install an app. When you install that app, so let's say you install Blender at some point in the future, you just install Blender into your Claude OS, and now you have a voice control into Blender.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And Claude is providing that voice control, and you have this app. And whether that is a plugin, whether that, where exactly that's running,
yes,
no longer matters.
It will be irrelevant as long as, or as soon as we've got this registry component, because at the moment, the registry is your MCP client. In this case, Cloud Desktop. You need to effectively register every MCP server, but even runs locally because there is no discovery as such.
Right.
And I think this is the missing component, because as soon as it gets broader adoption, right? I would love to install a plugin, right, with an installer, something that I'm conscious that I'm installing a piece of software on my computer. But then it should be possible for Cloud Desktop to just say, "Hey, I see that you now have Blender, available," or just I do a slash command and suddenly I can, force my Claude to actually use some of Blender capabilities, in the form of tools. And that makes sense.
I can see. So that actually takes me to Mark's other question that he had.
What clients are there that support MPC servers? So, for example, Cloud Desktop, MCP Inspector, but how widely or how broad is the acceptance of MCP servers?
So effectively, you need to think about the MCP clients, and similar as you have the awesome MCP servers list, you have the awesome MCP clients list, right? And at the moment, it's growing because quite a lot of those pieces of software that I consider wrappers around, different models or multi-models that effectively provide you with a chat GPT interface or similar, and just the ability to access, a whole variety of different models. These guys are now adding capabilities for them to become the MCP clients, right? And I would also see them as people who are gonna lead the way in terms of making it easier for the users to actually install this stuff. And if not already, because I haven't gone through all of them by no means, I would see them having the ability to install those MCP servers. Because if you think about it, if you have a registry at some point, it should really be like a plugin directory or like a marketplace. And this is where, to me, it starts becoming, in this vision, it starts becoming this other marketplace of things, right? Where you can just press, as a user, you can press a button and it installs this plugin. It installs maybe this piece of software with the plugin for you. And suddenly you have additional capabilities because, Blender is one example. It could be, an audio production plugin, a podcast production plugin, a video, editor, and all of the things that normally require quite a bit of knowledge that can be exposed to people through natural language, which is perfect. I mean, this is the vision that we certainly had a number of years back, right, where we were thinking like, oh, it would be awesome to talk to your smart speaker and be able to effectively express what you want and get it in return, right? Why wouldn't I be able to ask my Alexa to generate me a 3D model and then it gets executed on my computer?
Well, I think what this starts getting to is so I guess once again we just went off into a bunch of different avenues.
Mhm.
I guess addressing Mark's question, the other thought I had is I'm starting to see this showing up in various libraries on the client side.
Mhm.
So, for example, LangChain now has a MCP client module,
Yeah.
so that if you are building agents using LangChain and LangGraph, you can say, oh, and here are the plugins for the tools. You don't need to go define the tools yourself. You're not installing them with the library. You're just installing them with MCP.
And in the context of agents, it makes perfect sense. But only for me, only in the context of an agent increasing their internal capability with X, Y, or Z that exposed it as an MCP server. It
Right.
makes perfect sense, and I think it's going to be more and more widely used in general, but it still doesn't quite address the problem that you have to have those MCP servers installed locally, right? It would be a completely different discussion if those MCP servers were standalone remote components or remote servers that you can just hook into. And that
Right.
makes even if like that for especially for agentic applications or agents. Let's just focus on a single agent for the moment, right? It makes perfect sense. But if now, as an agent developer, I need to install, or like in the process of deployment, I need to install a whole bunch of other pieces of software that are MCP servers from different repositories, from different providers, it quickly becomes, a nightmare, and
And
we're diving into DLL hell almost,
right.
because we
And
haven't even started talking about versioning. And I'm sorry, Aleph, but
no, thank you, because I needed that nightmare right now. No, you're right. And I think for me, it starts getting into if I'm writing the agentic software, what's my advantage of using, MCPs versus using libraries? Why can't I, why shouldn't my, Slack library, because they're providing a library in Python. They're already providing a library in JavaScript. What's to stop them from just as part of that library saying, oh, and here's the tool definition that you would use?
I would see advantage of MCP servers, and you know where it would be? Again, if they were remote and handled and
Yes.
maintained by someone else, because suddenly Slack has a new functionality, right? You've got an agent that uses Slack MCP server. That MCP server runs at a certain version that doesn't have that tool definition. What do you need to do? You need to upgrade it. You need to have a process for it. Rather
Yes.
than it sits somewhere else, you just connect to that MCP servers, you discover the tools, and if there's a new tool, you suddenly have it available, which it's
Well,
what it's was supposed to be, right?
and then I mean, okay. Once again, this branches into two questions. Let me hit the
Mm-hmm.
easy one, what I
Okay.
think is the easy one first. And that so what is it? What do we need? What does the MCP protocol need to get to the to where we can have Google and Slack and everybody, all of the big companies and the not so big companies, setting up remote MCP servers? What are the things that the protocol needs still? I have my guesses, but I'm curious on your take.
Well, I mean, the no-brainer is security, or a definition of security, because if we leave it as something that is undefined and and open, as in like, oh, you need to just implement this, then everyone is going to implement it differently.
But security is a big thing. What,
Yeah.
what parts of, I can think of
Well,
at least two parts of security that we need.
specifically authentication and authorization, like the basic fact that you need to A, authenticate against something and know that you can even access it, and then B, that you can access the right resources. Right? And that also ties into the resources that MCP might be providing as such, right? Or giving you access to on the other end. So
Right.
at the moment, this is something that is, um, it's super vague, right? It's sort of mentioned, but it's not really defined, and it's left there for interpretation.
Right. And one of the things that I realized was interesting is I was actually looking at the protocol for a competitor for something that was designed around the same time that MCP was, but was introduced later, so nobody's paying any attention to it. And I'm not even going to give its name. But one of the things that it did was it identified, here's how you send an OAuth token. And then it said, and here's why. And I really was impressed by this because they were saying you don't want it as part of the function definition, because otherwise that function definition is going to get handed to an LLM. And the LLM is going to invent its own OAuth token to hand back. It's going to hallucinate a token.
Yep.
And you want to be able to say on some level, here are the things that we expect the LLM to fill in. And here are the things that we don't, that you somehow need to give us, or that our library will provide.
And absolutely, I think that's the key of those protocols. All of them is that you make this separation of, you've got this client, you've got this server, they talk to each other, right? And then you've got tools that are being used by the LLMs. You've got the prompts that are being used by the LLM, right? That makes sense. But in terms of MCP, this is again vague and open for interpretation.
And I mean, it just dawned on, when I'm reading this, I'm like, oh, of course, you need to break down what are the things that are, that the LLM is going to talk about, and what's the other context that a client is expected to have and manage and maintain, but the LLM is not. And I thought that was a brilliant awareness on the part of this protocol designer, that, you do need to have authentication as a very, very separate part from the function definition. The other thing that I found was shockingly missing from this, and we know this from our experience with Alexa, with Google Assistant, is the monetization angle. I mean, I understand why Anthropic didn't really want to have, a monetization component on their end. But Blender might, or somebody who's offering a Blender service would, or that seems like a shockingly missing aspect of this.
Again, left for, interpretation and something that is handled completely outside. Which to some extent it might make sense, and maybe, they left it open so that it's being handled around the time when they introduced the registry, and maybe that's where we're gonna find that aspect being addressed in some way, shape, or form. But yes, it's very vague at the moment, and maybe, to some extent I was actually trying to challenge myself and think about it from the perspective like, maybe they didn't want to define it so that they leave it up to the people and, their discretion to design and develop those things. But it doesn't help with the wider adoption, because then it creates a hell in terms of like, if you're an MCP client, for example, and suddenly you need to start handling quadrillion different authentication mechanisms because each of the MCP server developers defined
Came
their
up with their
own,
own scheme.
right?
Yeah.
It's going to be a nightmare at some point. It might not be now or yet, but at some point it's going to be hell to maintain. Certainly,
It's certainly going to start hindering widespread adoption of a way to do this. So turning to that registry question, what I found kind of amusing is that one of the things that we almost saw right from the beginning of say Android apps was almost immediately there was an Android app that would point you at other Android apps. Some of the earliest Alexa skills were Alexa skills that pointed you at other Alexa skills. Do we have the MCP server, not just that will point you at other MCP servers, but that become an MCP server meta server almost? Because if you think about it, if you have an MCP meta server, your agent can now always just go to the MCP meta server, say, what agents can answer this question, plug into those automatically, and now your agent just, can do everything.
The exception is it can't do the second stage, right? I'm not aware of any of those things. Although if you think about it, actually could, because if you have an MCP server running locally with all the permissions, then effectively it's capable of doing a git pull or whatever it needs to do in order to install another MCP server and basically become one of those installers. And maybe I haven't looked in a lot of depth at the installers. Maybe some of the installers already work as that, which, it's like, if you think about it, it's just an implementation of a marketplace or Corman's marketplace.
Right. I mean, if you're familiar with something like, Homebrew as an example, this is something that can just install other things. And if you now think of a Homebrew MCP server,
a good question.
Interesting angle.
It's a good question. I'm certainly going to look for one right now. Although there's nothing I can't find. I'm trying to jog my memory, but I can't remember that I've seen anything like that.
And and it's interesting because thinking about that, you're right. Having it as the local installation is really one of the biggest barriers on that front. And if we address the authentication, the monetization angle, an MCP meta server that will point out other services that will let you install other services, and you can. If some of the metadata that came back in the phone call was, and here's how much it costs, and here's what subscriptions required, and here's the authentication required.
You know what?
Seems really powerful.
I already looked it up. MetaMCP.com. There it is. It's already there. It's actually called Meta MCP. And it's again right at the top of the MCP list, and it looks like there are already about 10 aggregators. I'm not entirely sure if all of them are gonna actually act as an MCP server themselves, but there's certainly those installers and aggregators as such. So
that just seems like an easy next step.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so the final thing, I say that, is Google at Cloud Next recently announced another protocol, which they call the agent-to-agent protocol, or A2A.
Yep.
How does that fit into this scheme?
To me, it doesn't. I think there are two. I think there are actually two different things for two different that could be used for two different reasons. The way I see A2A is really the agent-to-agent communication protocol that we would use in a multi-agent setup, where you would have your assistants, so clients, actually making calls to agents, and then agents making calls or using other agents. I would still see MCP as something that would sit on the edge of individual agents and provide functionality into those agents directly. But A2A, in my view, right now, and again, I'm not no expert by any stretch of the imagination, but this is precisely where I see that being most useful.
And to be fair, Google isn't pitching it as an as something that's different from MCP. They're pitching it as a companion to it.
Yep.
So that while MCP would be that protocol you use to talk to agents, to talk to services, agent to agent is the one where the different services talk to each other on your behalf. And I'm no expert either. That's about as much as I understand of it. And I kind of get it in theory. I kind of get this notion of, MCP will, I will be asking Claude Desktop or my local agent to do something. And it may use MCP to go dispatch this to somewhere else. To use your 3D printing as an example, I may say, I want a 3D printed heart. Okay, so my agent finds a service that will do this. It sends it out to that service to come up with a rendering. That service then hands it off to the printing agent, the one that'll actually do the work, to print it, and that one will then hand it off to the shipping agent, which will have my shipping and billing information, and then get it sent to me, all without my local agent getting involved. I feel like that's what it is doing, or what it's making available abstractly, but I don't get how it's doing that. I haven't wrapped my head around what it needs to do that.
The big question in my head is, are we going to have MCP servers as the connectors into software, or are we going to have agents that do stuff on our behalf with some software? Because this is where where MCP might be rendered, not to say useless, but not required. Because if you have a Blender agent, right, that runs somewhere or maybe runs locally on your computer, so rather than installing a Blender plugin as an MCP server, right, you install a Blender agent that in theory should be a little bit more knowledgeable and a little bit more self-sufficient in terms of what it might do. Then where's the need for an MCP server in such case? Nowhere, because then you've got an agent, and I would rather have agents, because sometimes as users we don't necessarily know what we want, or we might not be able to express it in the way that that is describing it best. And 3D printing or 3D designing is a good example, right? You might say, I want this in the shape of that. And then there needs to be some level of maybe parsing what you want, and then taking that language and converting it into something that is more understandable, maybe asking you a follow-up question, right? And then suddenly MCP is not the thing to be used there.
That's an excellent point. When thinking about Voodoo Drive, and how it works with spreadsheets, each request that I make, just adding a row, for example. Well, adding a row really involves a whole bunch of things. It's copying some data, it's formatting some data, it's doing things in some cases and not doing things in other cases. Copying formulas but not numbers. That's several function calls. Yes, I could express those function calls as atomic things to an LLM, but I didn't. I expressed this one broader concept of add a row or copy a row. What's the right level of abstraction that we should be providing to our LLMs? Is it that higher level thing, or is it the low level thing with a lot of other human prompts about how we go about certain operations? Or let it deduce how we go about certain operations.
A very good question about how to design your tool definitions for the software that you have, because you can have so many different levels where you can define that. And I think there is no right answer to this question, or right or wrong. I think it's going to depend on, what's the level of control that you want to be handing off to LLM that is being then driven by the user. And who's the user? Is it the power user? Is it is it the power user that might need those atomic things as
Right.
tools,
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
So I think it will depend. But then again, you might ask a question. Maybe there is an agent that actually understands who the user is, and then takes the decision whether to use a higher level of abstraction add row function or something that is lower level.
Well, I guess what I feel like is the agent does become that higher level abstraction. Somebody will design that agent with some lower level abstractions, but maybe not low enough. So there's another, maybe some of those lower level abstractions are agents of their own.
Yeah.
And, at what level does the human choose to interact with these systems?
Yeah,
and
but
I don't have the answer to that yet.
I don't think we're gonna provide a good answer at this point, because this is gonna be the outcome of the actual experimentation and people building stuff with it and for it. The one thing that is quite clear is that once you start building agents that are specialized for a given piece of software, there's no more need for MCPs, because then you're going to be better off giving those agents direct access to your APIs in the form of, tool definition. I mean, there is no justification for having another abstraction layer in between. It's just going to add latency, which you don't want to do.
Which is, yeah, I was going to say, this can't be, what we have now isn't good for latency as it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of things that are here, that are coming, that are known, that are unknown. This has been fantastic, Michal. I'm so glad you got us started on this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for the discussion. I think we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, and this is the time to experiment. This is the time to build. This is the time to actually experience it for yourself, and make up your own mind about this stuff. And I think MCP as a protocol is going to evolve either way. The good thing is that there is the adoption that we see at the moment, because hopefully that's going to be the largest driver of where it's going to go.
And as it evolves and as we explore, I'd love to hear what other people's experiences are. Best place to find you is still on LinkedIn?
Yes, definitely.
So share your thoughts there, leave them in the comments below, and we're going to be exploring this a lot more, I am quite sure.
Oh yeah.
On Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs.
Take care, Michal.
Take care, Alan. Thank you so much for the invitation.